So how do we break free from our two-party system? Here's how. According to Katherine, Gehl, and Michael Porter in their book, The Politics Industry, there's one really good way we can change things up so that the grip of the two parties isn't as strong as it is today. How do we break free from the two-party system? We change our election rules so that two things happen. One, votes aren't wasted, and two, independent third-party candidates actually have a chance. How do we get there? The first is party primaries. Party primaries are the election before the election. Before you see your November ballot, you have to decide who's going to be on the ballot. So the Democrats, the Republicans, they hold their primaries to decide who the nominee is going to be, and those winners then go on to go head-to-head in November. Well, here's the problem. If you live in a place that's reliably Democratic or reliably Republican, reliably red or reliably blue, you already know who the winner is. So what happens with the party primary that happens like 6 months before the general election is whoever wins the primary, that decides who will already win in November. Because whoever wins the Democratic nomination in California, they're gonna win in November. To put it another way, your vote doesn't matter in November because the winner was already decided 6 months ago before you even got to the voting booth in November. And to be fair, this is very specific to all of those congressional districts, etc., that are reliably red, reliably blue, which, you know, again, is a lot of them. The book references that 80% of congressional races are basically pre-decided in the primary. One other issue with party primaries is that states that do it, they have what's called sore loser laws. A sore loser law says if you lost that Republican or that Democratic primary, you're not allowed to come back guns a-blazing in November as an independent, barring a lot of third-party independent candidates from running, or in examples that they give in the book, people that actually get a lot of votes just because they lost the Democratic nomination aren't allowed to run again, even though most people would actually vote for them if they ran. Just a quick note, if you don't vote in the party primaries, if you only vote in November, then your vote doesn't matter. If your vote doesn't matter, then who the hell is picking the person that wins in these reliably red or blue states or districts, right? Well, it's the party primary voters. Less than 20% of eligible voters vote in the primary. So that means less than 20% of the population is responsible for deciding who ends up in Congress, for example, through these elections. And the authors also point out that party primary voters tend to be more further on the ideological spectrum, either to the left or to the right. And what this causes is when candidates have to win the primary in order to win the election, they go into their party primaries trying to convince these very on the opposite sides of the spectrum, these very ideological voters, as the authors put it. What that does is it drives the candidates more and more to the left and more to the right, which is possibly one explanation for what we're seeing with candidates these days, where they seem to be going really far in either direction, where, as they say, sort of the moderate politician isn't really in existence anymore. If you're a party primary voter, good for you. You have an incredibly high influence on who wins elections. But for the vast majority of Americans in these reliably red or blue states, if you don't vote in the primaries, then basically, at least for these positions on the general ballot, you're not voting at all. And that's one of the issues that the book is trying to solve for, okay? Before we get to the solution, let's talk about plurality voting, the second way that our votes are made cheap, and another way that independents and third-party candidates are told you have no chance. Plurality voting. What is plurality voting? Let's say you're in a 3-candidate election. There's a Democrat, there's a Republican, and then there's an independent. Let's say you want to vote for the independent. You vote for the independent, but guess what? The independent loses, obviously. Sorry, America, that's how it happens in America, right? So the independent loses. Your vote, that's it. You're done. It's over, and people will tell you you wasted your vote, and people will tell the candidate who is the independent, you just spoiled the election. next time, don't run. You're gonna spoil it. You're gonna take votes from this person or that person. And just one final point here. With plurality voting, it's also a first past the post system. So what that means is in a 3-person race, let's say the 3 people split it all evenly. That means someone got 33%, the other person got 33%, but let's say you got someone that got 34%. That person will be declared the winner. First past the post, they got the most, right? With 34%. But think about this. That means around 66% of voters wanted somebody else. And that's one thing that the authors sort of point out in terms of like an issue with plurality voting. You can get candidates who actually don't represent the majority of the people in that district or that state. So again, like, why does voting feel so pointless? Well, because party primaries make it so that the election was already decided before you got to the voting booth. It also makes it so that if you vote for a third party candidate because you really believe in them, and then that person loses, then your vote's lost, right? And it's just kind of thrown away in the trash. If this is the way that our system is, what do we do about it so that we don't feel like voting is so pointless or so futile, and we empower people that want to challenge Democrats or Republicans to run and hopefully succeed? Let me phrase it this way. We do what certain states and certain cities in the United States are already doing. And this is how we do it. It's what they call final 5 voting. And here's what we do. Instead of party primaries, we have non-partisan primaries. And instead of plurality voting, we have ranked choice voting with instant runoffs. And we'll go over what this means, okay? Let's look at the first one. Non-partisan primaries. So instead of the Democrats and the Republicans doing their little private parties and deciding who the nominee is, and then you only have 2 choices, this is how it's different. Everyone who wants to run and be on the general election ballot in November, everyone has to run together. We don't separate the Republicans from the Democrats. The Democrats, the Republicans, the independents, the Green parties, the Libertarians, and anyone else, anyone else who wants to run gets to run in this open primary. And not only is it open for candidates, but it's open for everyone to vote. So, because one of the issues with party primaries was if you're not a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, in a lot of cases, you're not even allowed to vote. In the nonpartisan primaries, everyone is allowed to vote regardless of party affiliation. All the candidates are in the same bullpen. They have to convince us to get their vote. And once we tally up all the votes, then the top 5 people go on to the general election. And the significance of this, of making it so that 5 people go on to the election in November, remember the issue with party primaries. The election in reliably red or blue states was already decided in the primary because you had a Democrat and a Republican. Those were your choices. And once you knew who the Republican was in a Republican stronghold, then you knew the Republican was going to win, right? When you have 5, that delays deciding who the winner is until November. And okay, let's say even if independents and third-party candidates didn't even stand a chance. With 5, you could still end up with 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. So you still don't know, even if it's a reliably red or blue state, you still don't know among those 3 Republicans who the winner would be, or from those Democrats in a blue district who the winner will be. You know, on the point of making your vote matter, when you delay the voting and deciding who the winner is until November, that means everyone that didn't vote in the primary, your vote in November still matters, because we're not deciding it until we see what November voters decide. So we decided who's going to be on the general election ballot. The next part is how we vote in the general election, because we want to avoid 2 things. Even though, great, we got rid of party primaries, okay? Even if that's the case, what we don't want to happen is, 1, you vote for the independent and your vote gets wasted because you had 1 vote, you gave it to the independent, they lost, and your vote gets thrown in the trash, okay? We don't want that to happen. We have to control for that. The second is, if the race splits evenly amongst 5 people, we don't want someone that got 21% of the vote to be the winner. That sucks, right? That means 80% of people wanted somebody else to win, right? So we have to control for those 2 things. And that's what a ranked choice general election with instant runoffs does. Okay, I know that's a mouthful, but let's see how it works in practice. Instead of having 1 vote and giving it to one person. And if that person loses, that vote goes away forever. We use what's called a ranked choice system. And what we do is we list out all 5 of the candidates. And then when you vote, you're not just voting for one person. You vote for who you like first place, who you like second place, third place, all the way down to 5th place. How do we decide who the winner is? Well, everyone submits their preferences, and then we tally up the votes. With this system, you need to get 50% plus 1 extra vote minimum to win an election. Unlike in the plurality system, if someone gets a true majority, 50% plus 1, by being people's number 1 choice, that person wins automatically. But let's say you didn't get someone that got a 50% true majority. Let's say candidate A got 34% of the vote, candidate B got 33% of the vote, and then the rest is divided unevenly amongst the remaining candidates. What happens then? We need someone to get to 50%. So what happens, since no one did, we eliminate whoever got the least amount of votes. Let's say that was E. E gets eliminated. But here's the difference. People that voted for E, their vote does not get thrown away. We then look, what did these people choose as their number 2 choice? Those votes get allocated to the person that got the 2nd place, added to the number 1 votes that they got. And we repeat this process until we find someone who actually gets 50% plus 1 vote from the voting electorate in that district. And in this way, we're going to ensure that whoever wins the election actually does represent a majority of Americans. And in terms of the third-party independent candidate, they're no longer told they spoil the election. Because if they make it past the nonpartisan primary and make it onto the general election ballot in November, if someone votes for them but they lose, that voter's vote does not get thrown in the trash. It goes to who they picked number 2. And if that still isn't enough, to their number 3 onward until we get a true majority. Now, in going over all this stuff, is this just pie in the sky? Well, as I kind of referenced earlier, there are states and cities in the United States that have adopted some form of Final 5 voting, and Americans are already voting in systems like this. The most recent example is Alaska. Alaska in 2020 passed top 4 voting, or Final 4 voting. So they do the exact same system with nonpartisan primaries, but instead of 5 people, it's the top 4 people, regardless of party, that get to go on to the next to the general election. California, Washington, they do top 2, and in many cities, including San Francisco and Minneapolis, they have adopted ranked choice voting, and voters are happy. Just on that note, okay, let's say you do switch over to this kind of system. Like, what will you see as a citizen? In areas that have adopted this form of voting, you start to see incumbents lose. And incumbents are losing not to other people, but people in their own party who are reaching out to a broader cross-section of Americans voting in that district. Another thing that you see in areas where this form of voting is adopted is in San Francisco, they saw that campaign advertising materials, what you get during election time, they were less attack ads and more informative pieces of information, because candidates have discovered that when they have to not only be people's number 1 choice, but also people's number 2 choice, just attacking your opponent isn't good enough. You see less attack ads and more actual debate about issues in areas where these forms of voting are adopted. Okay, well, and here's the thing. Let's say you've gone on this ride and you're like, okay, this all sounds good, but how do we actually get this done? Particularly, there's one legitimate concern. With Final 5 voting, if it does in fact loosen the grip that the Democratic and Republican parties have on our elections, right? Why would they ever agree to it? Why would they accept final five voting if it lessens the power that they have in this two-party system? Legitimate concern. And the answer that the authors give is that we can bypass the politicians. We don't need a Democrat politician or a Republican politician to propose this in our state legislature. We can completely bypass the politicians by doing ballot initiatives in states. It differs from state to state, but generally it is a form of direct democracy in which we as citizens can get signatures, the classic get signatures. If we get enough signatures, we can get it on the ballot as citizens without having to go to a Democrat or Republican to lobby for it or advocate for it. Ballot initiatives is how it got passed in Alaska. It's how you got top two in California, in Washington. That's how ranked choice voting got voted on in Maine. If we're trying to find a way to get this done without having to rely on the two-party system that we're trying to escape, ballot initiatives, direct democracy from citizens is the way to do it. And we have the examples here to show us that it can get done. Here's fair warning though, and the authors do a pretty good job of prepping you for this. If you're gonna go down this route in your state, prepare to be sued. Okay, the Democrats and the Republicans are not going to take this lying down. They sued in Washington. They sued in Maine. They will do what they can to prevent Final Five voting from being implemented because, again, it is able to loosen the grip that they have on our political system. And I forget which writer said it, but the fact that the two parties go to court and fight so passionately to prevent this kind of voting from happening, I think is pretty telling. Gets them riled up a little bit, and I'm okay with them being riled up a bit. One thing that's important that the authors would like to keep in mind here is that in adopting Final Five voting, the goal is not to change who wins. That would completely defeat the purpose of what they're doing here. The goal here is to change the incentives of the politicians running for your vote. If a politician understands that people that will list them as their number one choice is only like 30% of the population, that's not enough to win the election. Not only do they have to rely on the people that will make them their number one choice, but they have to start convincing people that they should put them as their number two choice as well. As soon as you start doing that, you get politicians that understand they need to start talking to more people and start addressing the issues of more than just their party primary voters, which typically is less than 20% of the US population. Katherine Gehl, one of the authors, she was on a podcast not too long ago, and she wanted to make the following point. In proposing Final Five voting, it's not that we're saying we need more political parties. Another way to say that is more political parties is not the answer here. What Final Five voting does is it creates the threat of new competition so that whoever is running on the Democratic or the Republican ticket, because let's face it, those parties aren't going anywhere. But with the threat of new competition and the ability of third-party candidates to actually have a chance of winning an election, or creating that very threat that they might be ousted by someone who appeals to more people, it's that environment that we want to change so that we can get better results for us as we vote in November. So I think that's it. I'm sweating. Okay, you know what? Yeah, I think that's it. That's it. Of course, we're all stuck in this two-party system as it is right now, but we're in it together. And there are already states, there are already citizens showing us that there are different ways to vote that can get us different results and get our politicians to start working better for us. All right? So that's it. Thanks for your time. We appreciate it. And bye-bye.